The morning the mules arrived was a Tuesday in late March of 1998. I remember the year because it was the year my youngest went off to college, and the quiet on the place was so loud it felt like a pressure in my ears. The air held that specific late winter dampness, a low, wet fog that clung to the bare branches of the oak trees and made the gravel on the county road sound soft under tyres. The sky was the colour of old tin. The truck that brought them was long and low, a double-decker stock trailer pulled by a man who looked as tired as the miles he'd driven. He handed me the paperwork, a flimsy carbon copy that smelled of diesel and cheap coffee. 24 head. Not horses, not even fine-bred show mules. These were heritage mules, what my grandfather would have called working stock. They were scrappy, opinionated, with long, intelligent ears that swiveled to take in every sound. A mix of colours, sorrel, bay, a few duns, and one that was almost black. They weren't beautiful in the way a thoroughbred is beautiful. They were beautiful in the way a well-made tool is beautiful, designed for a purpose, with no ounce of their being wasted on vanity. They backed down the ramp one by one, their hooves finding the soft earth with a quiet certainty. They clustered together for a moment, then spread out, their heads dropping to test the thin March grass. The cost had been $12,000, cash. It was every penny I had in my operating account and then some. It was money I was supposed to be using as a down payment on a new front-end loader, a big green and yellow machine with air conditioning and a radio and more hydraulic power than a man could ever rightly use. The dealer had been calling me every other day. He quoted me a price of $150,000 with financing that felt more like an anchor than a lifeline. I stood there, my hands in my pockets, the cold seeping into my bones, and watched $12,000 worth of stubbornness get acquainted with my bottom pasture. By 10 a.m., my neighbor's truck pulled up. It was a new Ford, a shade of blue so deep and polished you could see the worried look on your own face in the door panel. He never got out. He just rolled down the passenger window, the electric motor whirring in the quiet morning. He rested one arm on the sill, a clean, uncalloused arm. He nodded toward the pasture. The mules, for their part, paid him no mind. A few had flicked their ears in his direction when the truck pulled up, then dismissed him as unimportant. "Morning," he said. He had a way of talking that was polite, but always felt like he was leading up to a question you didn't want to answer. "Heard you were getting a new loader," he said, his eyes not on me, but on the mules. I just nodded, decided to go a different way. He chewed on that for a second. He was a good farmer, a modern farmer. His fields were clean, his yields were high, and his equipment was always the newest and the biggest. He farmed with data, with spreadsheets and satellite maps. He believed in efficiencies. He did not believe in things that ate when they weren't working. 24 of them, he said, as if confirming a rumor he'd heard. That's a lot of mouths to feed for a... What is it you're doing with them exactly? I looked out at the mules. One of them had started to roll in a patch of dry dirt, kicking its legs in the air with a kind of deliberate joy. "I'm farming," I told him. It was the plainest truth I had. He gave a slow, disbelieving smile. It wasn't unkind, but it was clear. It was the smile you give a child who tells you he's going to dig a hole to China. "Right," he said, the smile fading into a look of polite concern. "Well, don't let them eat the fence posts." He rolled the window up and drove away, his tires crunching on the gravel with a sound that felt final. By noon, the diner in town had a version of the story, and by the time the co-op closed, the version had grown. I was broke, I was sentimental, I was losing my mind. I was trying to turn the clock back to a time that was best left forgotten. And in a way, they weren't wrong. But they weren't right either. They saw 24 expensive pets. They saw a foolish old man trading a new machine for a museum piece. They didn't see what I saw. They didn't see the North 40, a piece of ground so stubborn and compacted it broke plowshares and hearts with equal indifference. They didn't have the memory of a calloused hand on their shoulder or the weight of a quiet truth spoken in a barn long since fallen down. I stood there until the fog started to burn off, watching the mules. They had a way of moving, a way of testing the ground under their feet that was different from a horse, more careful, more deliberate. They paid attention, and I knew, standing there in the thin March sunlight, that they already knew something about this land that the man in the clean blue truck would never understand. They knew the ground wasn't a spreadsheet. They knew you couldn't bully it into giving you what you wanted. You had to listen to it. And I was, for the first time in a long time, ready to listen. I want to be honest about my reasons. It wasn't just about the money, though the thought of that loan payment hanging over my head for the next 10 years was enough to give a man night sweats. It wasn't just about being stubborn, though I'll own that there's a certain satisfaction in doing something the experts tell you is foolish. The real reason went back 40 years, to a hot summer afternoon when I was 10 years old. My grandfather was still alive then. He was a small, wiry man with hands that looked like they were carved from oak. He was a product of the Depression, and he never trusted anything he couldn't fix with a wrench and a piece of baling wire. By the time I was a boy, he'd mostly given in to the modern world. He had a tractor, a small, sputtering John Deere that seemed to run on sheer cussedness. But he kept one team of mules, a pair of big sorrels named Jude and Sal. He kept them, he said, for the places the tractor couldn't go and the jobs the tractor was too stupid to do. That summer, he was clearing a small 3-acre plot down by the creek. It was choked with scrub brush and small saplings. Everyone told him it was wasted effort. The soil was thin, they said, too rocky. It would never be worth the sweat. I remember sitting on the fence watching him. He had Jude and Sal hitched to a single-bottom walking plough. He didn't shout at them. He spoke to them in a low, conversational tone, a click of the tongue, a soft ha or gee. The mules seemed to understand not just the words, but the intention behind them. They moved with a slow, powerful grace, their feet placing themselves with an uncanny precision. When they hit a rock, they didn't lurch or fight. They would stop, wait for my grandfather to come and assess the situation, then put their shoulders into the harness and ease the plough around it. When they got to a thick patch of roots, they would lean into the work, their muscles bunching, their breath coming in steady snorts, until the roots gave way with a sound like tearing cloth. Later, I asked him why he didn't just use the tractor. It would have been faster. He could have ripped the whole patch clear in a morning. He stopped what he was doing and wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked at me. Then he looked at the ground the mules had just turned. "Look here," he said, and he knelt down. He crumbled a piece of the dark, freshly turned soil in his fingers. A man with a machine is always in a hurry. He's thinking about the next row, the next field, the end of the day. A machine doesn't know the difference between a rock and a root. It just breaks, or it gets stuck. He pointed to the mules who were standing patiently, their ears drooping in the heat. An animal is already there. It's not thinking about the next row. It's thinking about its next step. It feels the ground through its feet. It knows when to pull and when to wait. It's not fighting the land. It's having a conversation with it. He stood up and brushed the dirt from his knees. "Some ground," he said, looking me straight in the eye. "You can't force. You have to persuade it." That was the lesson. It settled into me that day and never left. For years I forgot it. I got bigger tractors. I bought wider implements. I chased yields just like everyone else. I got caught up in the hurry. I started looking at the ground as a problem to be solved with horsepower and steel. And the North 40 was the problem I could never solve. It was 40 acres of what should have been my best land. It lay flat, it had good sun, and the soil map said it was prime loam, but it never produced. The seed would go in, the plants would come up looking good, and then, around July, they would just seem to give up. The ears of corn would be small and stunted,
The soybeans would look pale and anemic. Every year, the extension agent would come out. He'd take his soil samples, he'd look at his charts, and he'd give me a new recommendation. More nitrogen, more potash, a different hybrid. He talked about it like it was a chemistry equation. We did everything he said. We spent a fortune on fertilizer. We tried deep ripping with a subsoiler that took 300 horsepower to pull and burned 50 gallons of diesel in an afternoon. Nothing worked.
The field would yield 85 bushels of corn in a year, when the fields right across the fence line were doing 180. It was a money pit. My neighbor, the one with the clean truck, had offered to rent it from me. "I'll tile it," he'd said. "Run a pattern every 30 feet. That's your problem. It's got a wet foot." But it wasn't wet. In fact, in August, it was the driest piece of ground on the whole farm, hard and cracked like a clay pot. So when the time came to sign the papers for that new loader, a machine designed for speed and power and brute force, I thought of my grandfather. I thought of Jude and Sal. I thought of that conversation, and I realized I've been trying to solve the problem of the North 40 with the wrong kind of thinking. I'd been trying to force it. I needed to persuade it. I needed something that paid attention. I needed something that would have a conversation with the land instead of shouting at it. That's when I picked up the phone and called a man in Missouri I'd heard about. A man who raised and sold old-style working mules. The loader could wait. The land had been waiting a lot longer. After my grandfather died, my father and I cleaned out his workshop. It was a small, dusty building that smelled of motor oil, sawdust, and time. My father was a practical man. He saw tools to be sorted, scrap metal to be sold, junk to be hauled away. I was 17, and I saw a museum of a life I was only just beginning to understand. Tucked away in an old wooden crate, underneath a set of harness spreaders and a collection of oddly shaped wrenches, I found his notebooks. There were 3 of them, marbled composition books, the kind you can buy at any drugstore. The covers were soft and worn at the corners. The pages were filled with his handwriting, a careful, blocky script written in pencil. The pencil had been pressed so hard into the paper that the words were a physical part of the page, a topography of thought. For years, I just kept them. They moved with me from the shelf in my teenage bedroom to a box in my first apartment to the bottom drawer of the desk in my own farmhouse office. I take them out sometimes on a quiet winter night and just hold them. They were a connection to him, a tangible piece of his mind. He wasn't a man for diaries or journals. These notebooks were ledgers of work. They were filled with dates, weather observations, planting records, and notes on equipment repair. April 12, 1952. Rain all day, fixed flat on the wagon. Sal threw a shoe. May 5th, 1955. Planted corn in the south field. Soil is warm. Crows are thick. It was the simple, unadorned record of a life lived in conversation with the seasons. After I bought the mules, after my neighbor drove away and the gossip started at the diner, I knew it was time to read the notebooks, not just for sentiment, but for information. I took them out to the barn that night. I sat on an overturned bucket under a single, bare bulb, the new mules shuffling and breathing softly in the stalls behind me. The air was cool and smelled of hay and the clean, earthy scent of the animals. I opened the first notebook. The early entries were all about the transition from horses to tractors. He wrote about the cost of fuel versus the cost of feed. He detailed the maintenance on his new farm-all tractor, the frustration of a fouled spark plug, the miracle of hydraulic power. He was a man caught between 2 worlds, and his notes reflected it. He was excited by the new technology, but skeptical of its promises. Then I found what I was looking for. It was in the second notebook, dated 1958. He had sold off most of his horses by then, but he had just bought the team of mules, Jude and Sal. He had a whole section dedicated to them. He noted their feed consumption, their temperament, their strengths and weaknesses. And then I saw the entry for the North 40. For years that field had been in pasture. My grandfather was the first one to break it with a plough.
The first entries were full of hope. June 3rd, 1959. Broke the North 40, ploughed deep, soil looks black and rich. But as the years went on, the tone of the entries changed. July 20th, 1961. Corn on the North 40 looks yellow, needs a rain, but the ground is hard as a rock. October 5th, 1963. Yield on the North 40 is a disappointment again, 70 bushels. The South field did 110. He was having the same problem I was, 35 years later. He tried different things. He spread manure, he planted clover. The yields would tick up a little, then fall back.
He wrote about the tractor stalling out, the plow point snapping on something solid that wasn't a rock. He couldn't figure it out. Then, near the back of the notebook, on a page by itself, I found a different kind of entry. It wasn't a log of work done. It was a question. The handwriting was the same, but it felt more urgent. He had drawn a rough map of the North 40. In the middle of the map, he had written a single underlined sentence, and next to it, a large, looping question mark. The sentence read, "Bedrock high or just pan?" And underneath that, another line, "Mules never refused it. Tractor always stalls." I sat there on that bucket for a long time, the book open on my knees. The single bulb above me hummed. The mules shifted in their stalls. Bedrock high or just pan? A plow pan, a hard pan, a layer of compacted soil deep under the surface, created by years and years of heavy equipment running over the same ground, plowing to the same depth. It forms a layer as impermeable as concrete. Water can't penetrate it, so the soil above becomes waterlogged in the spring. Roots can't break through it, so in the heat of summer, the plants can't reach the deep moisture below. They starve in a field of plenty. The tractor, with its weight and its rigid plow, would hit that pan and either slide over it or get stuck. It was fighting it. But the mules never refused it. Why? What did they know? What did they feel? My grandfather had asked the question, but he'd never found the answer. He had died the next winter. The notebook was his last will and testament, a cryptic piece of inherited wisdom. He had left me a map and a mystery. And now I had 24 reasons shuffling in the dark behind me to go find the answer. The experts, with their soil charts and their chemical recommendations, had been looking at the top 6 inches of soil. My grandfather, and now me, we were asking what was happening 2 feet down.
He had given me the question. The mules, I suspected, were the answer. The next morning I was out before the sun. The air was sharp and cold, but there was a promise of warmth in the eastern sky. I didn't go to the North 40, not yet. I went to the barn. I spent the morning just being with the mules. I learned their names, which the seller had chalked onto a board. I learned their personalities. There was a big Jenny named Dolly who was the clear leader, a quiet, steady presence. There was a young John mule named Buster who was full of mischief and would try to steal a hat off your head. I brushed them, I checked their feet, I talked to them. My grandfather had always said you can't work with an animal you don't know. By the afternoon, I felt we had an understanding. Then I picked out a team of 4 of the steadiest ones, including Dolly. I had an old set of harnesses that had belonged to my grandfather, the same ones I'd found in the crate with the notebooks. The leather was dry and stiff, but the stitching was still good. It took me 2 hours to get them oiled and pliable, another hour to remember how to fit them properly to the animals. It was slow, frustrating work. My hands, accustomed to the feel of a steering wheel and the hydraulic lever, fumbled with the buckles and straps. More than once I was tempted to give up, to call the whole thing a foolish indulgence and go back to the house. But then I looked at the mules, standing patient and still, their long ears occasionally flicking back to listen to my muttered curses. They were waiting for me to figure it out. They had all the time in the world. Finally, I had them hitched to a walking plow, a single-bottom Oliver that had been rusting in the back of the machine shed for 30 years. It was the same plow my grandfather had used. I ran my hand over the pitted, rusted metal.
It felt like shaking hands with a ghost. I led the team out to the edge of the North 40. The field lay there, flat and brown and silent. It looked like any other field, but now it felt different. It felt like a challenge. I took a deep breath, took hold of the plow handles, and clicked my tongue. Dolly and the others leaned into their collars, and the plowshare bit into the earth. The first few passes were a struggle. The plow wanted to jump out of the ground. The mules wanted to go faster than I could walk. We were a clumsy, uncoordinated mess. I could feel the eyes of my neighbour from across the road, even if he wasn't there. I could hear the laughter from the diner, but I kept at it. I remembered the way my grandfather held the handles, the way he used his weight to keep the plough steady. I remembered the low, calm tones he used, and slowly we started to find a rhythm. The creak of the leather, the soft thud of the hooves, the whisper of the soil curling off the moldboard. It was a quiet music. After an hour, I stopped the team. I was sweating despite the cool air. I walked back and looked at the furrows we had made. They weren't as neat or as straight as the ones a tractor would make, but there was something different about them. I knelt down. The soil turned by a modern plough is often shattered, broken. This soil was lifted. It was turned in a long, continuous ribbon. I dug my hands into it. It was cool and dark and damp. I went back to the plough. We started again, and this time I paid attention not just to the plough, but to the mules. I watched their feet. A tractor tire is wide and flat. It compresses everything beneath it. A mule's hoof is small and concave. It exerts a surprising amount of pressure on a small point. As they walked, their hooves were sinking into the soil, punching through the plough layer. We got about a third of the way into the field, into the area my grandfather had marked on his map, and then I felt it. A change, a subtle vibration up through the plough handles. The mules didn't stop. They didn't lurch, but I felt them lean into the harness, just a little harder. The plough, which had been running at a depth of about 10 inches, suddenly wanted to go deeper. It was as if the ground beneath it had softened. I stopped the team and walked ahead. I had brought a soil probe with me, a simple T-handled steel rod. In the untouched ground ahead of the plough, I pushed the probe into the earth. It went down about 14 inches, and then it stopped. Dead. I put my full weight on it. It wouldn't budge. I had hit the pan. It felt like hitting a layer of concrete. I moved back to the furrow the mules had just plowed. I pushed the probe into the bottom of the furrow. It slid down, past the 14-inch mark, past 16, past 18, and kept going until it was buried up to the handle, a full 30 inches deep. The resistance was gone. It was like pushing a stick into butter. I pulled it out and looked at the tip. It was covered in a different kind of soil. Darker, wetter. It smelled different, richer, earthy, alive. The pan wasn't bedrock, it was just a dam built by 50 years of heavy tractors, and the mules were breaking it. Their hooves, with every step, were punching holes in that impermeable layer. The plough, following them, was lifting and turning the soil, but the real work was being done by the 4 small hooves of each animal, acting like 1,000 tiny subsoilers, driven by an intelligence that could feel the change in the ground beneath them. They weren't just ploughing the field, they were healing it. I stood there in the middle of that field, a steel rod in my hand, and I finally understood my grandfather's note. The mules never refused it, because for them it wasn't a wall, it was just a crust. And they knew with an instinct older than any tractor that the good stuff was underneath. The next 3 weeks passed in a slow, methodical rhythm. Every morning I was out with the mules. I rotated the teams, working them in shifts. I didn't try to plough the whole 40 acres at once. I worked in sections, letting the animals set the pace. It was a slow process. A modern tractor and plough could have turned that whole field in a day and a half. It took me and the 24 mules the better part of a month.
The town talk continued. My neighbour would drive by, slow down, and just shake his head before driving on. The fuel delivery man made a joke about whether I needed him to bring oats instead of diesel. I just smiled and nodded. I didn't have the words to explain what was happening, and even if I did, I knew they wouldn't believe me. The proof wasn't in the telling, it was in the doing. As I worked my way across the field, the change became more and more obvious. The first section I ploughed was the hardest. By the time I got to the far side of the field, the ground felt different even before the plough touched it. The mules walked with a spring in their step. The plough settled into its work with an easy grace. The hard pan, it seemed, wasn't a uniform sheet. It was a landscape of its own, with thick spots and thin spots, and we were breaking it apart, one furrow at a time. After the ploughing was done, I gave the field a week to rest. Then I came back, not with the plough, but with a disc harrow, another old piece of equipment I dragged out of the weeds. The mules pulled it easily. The purpose of the disc is to break up the clods of earth left by the plough and prepare a seed bed. On a normal field, it's a dusty, jarring job. On the North 40, it was different. The soil didn't shatter into dust, it crumbled. It was soft and friable, full of air and life. I knelt down and picked up a handful. It was teeming with earthworms, something I hadn't seen in that field in 20 years. They were a sign that the ecosystem of the soil was returning. The water could now move freely. The air could penetrate. The ground was breathing again. It was about this time that I got a visit from another kind of expert.
His name was Arthur, and he ran a small, independent seed company out of a town about 2 hours away. He specialized in heirloom and open-pollinated varieties of corn, the kinds of seeds that have been pushed aside by modern hybrids. I had called him because I figured if I was going to try an old method, I should use old genetics too. He was an old man, older than me, with a face like a road map and hands that had spent a lifetime in the dirt. He didn't drive a new truck. He drove a dusty 20-year-old station wagon that smelled of seed catalogues and pipe tobacco. He got out of the car and stood at the edge of the field, not saying a word for a long time. He just looked. He looked at the way the field lay, the texture of the soil, the way the light hit it. He wasn't looking at a data set. He was reading a story. "Heard you were doing something different over here," he said, without looking at me. "Thought I'd come see for myself." I told him the story. I told him about my grandfather, the notebook, the hard pan, the mules. I felt a little foolish saying it all out loud. It sounded like a folk tale. He listened patiently, nodding now and then, his eyes never leaving the field. When I was done, he walked out into the middle of the disc-harrowed ground. He didn't have a soil probe or a sample bag. He just knelt down, like I had, and dug his hands into the earth. He picked up a clump of soil and held it to his nose, inhaling deeply, as if it were a fine wine. He crumbled it between his fingers, feeling its texture. He sifted it, letting it run through his hands. He was silent for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the wind and the distant call of a red-winged blackbird. I waited for him to tell me I was crazy. I waited for him to give me a lecture on modern agronomy. Instead, he looked up at me, his eyes bright. He held up a piece of the soil, dark and crumbly, and threaded with the white tendrils of fungal hyphae. He looked at the soil, then at me, and he said one word: "Unlocked." That was it. He didn't need to say anything more. He stood up, brushing his hands on his pants. "Most folks," he said, his voice quiet and gravelly, "spend all their time yelling at the top 6 inches of their soil. They pour chemicals on it. They beat it with steel, trying to force it to do what they want. They never think to ask what it needs." He walked back to his car and pulled a small canvas bag from the back seat. "This is a 90-day corn, an old Reed's yellow dent. It's not the highest yielding variety I've got, but it's honest. It puts down deep roots. It knows how to find what it needs." He handed me the bag. "Plant this. Don't crowd it. Give it room to breathe. And don't over-fertilize it. This ground doesn't need a crutch anymore, it just needs a chance. He sold me enough seed for the 40 acres at a price that was more than fair. As he was leaving, he stopped and looked back at the mules who were watching us from their pasture. You know, he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, the difference between a problem and a lesson is only whether you were paying attention. He got in his dusty station wagon and drove away, leaving me there with a bag of old-fashioned seed and a field that had been unlocked. The word echoed in my mind. It was perfect. The wealth had been there all along. The fertility, the moisture, the life, it had just been locked away under a door that we had unknowingly built ourselves, and it didn't take $150,000 machine to open it. It just took patience. It just took listening. It took 24 stubborn, wonderful mules. I planted the corn the first week of May. I used an old 2-row planter, another refugee from the back of the shed, pulled by a team of 2 mules. It was slow, it was tedious, but it was right. I followed Arthur's advice and set the planter for a lower population, giving each seed more space. I wasn't trying to cram the field full. I was trying to create a community of plants that could support each other. The corn came up in 10 days, in neat, straight rows. It was a beautiful sight. The plants were a vibrant, healthy green. They didn't just sprout, they exploded out of the ground. For the first month, everything looked good, but then the real test came. June turned into July. The days grew long and hot. The rains, which had been plentiful in the spring, became scarce. This was the time of year when the North 40 always failed. This was when the plants, their roots unable to penetrate the hard pan, would run out of water and start to yellow and wither. I walked the field every day. I go out in the early morning when the dew was still on the leaves, and in the late evening as the sun was setting. I was nervous. I'd staked a lot on this gamble, not just money, but my pride. My neighbour had planted his corn at the same time, a modern hybrid designed for high populations and heavy fertilization. His field, right across the fence, was a solid wall of green, the plants so thick you couldn't see the ground between them. My field looked sparse by comparison. One evening he caught me at the fence line. "Looks a little thin, don't it?" he said. It wasn't a question. I just shrugged. "Giving them room to breathe," I said, echoing Arthur. He shook his head. "You're giving up yield is what you're doing. Every one of those empty spaces is a cob of corn you're not going to harvest." He was right, according to every piece of modern agricultural wisdom, but I held my nerve. The rain stopped altogether for 3 weeks in the middle of July. The sun beat down. The ground in my other fields started to crack. The corn there, which had looked so good, started to show signs of stress, the leaves curling in on themselves to conserve moisture. But in the North 40, something different was happening. The plants didn't curl. They stayed green. They kept growing. I went out with a spade and dug a hole between 2 of the rows. The top few inches of soil were dry, just like everywhere else. But below that, the ground was cool and dark and moist. The roots of the corn plants weren't spreading out horizontally, searching for surface water. They were going straight down, deep into the earth, following the channels that the mules' hooves and the earthworms had created. They had found the deep, stored moisture that had been locked away for 50 years. The unlocked field was acting like a giant sponge, holding the spring rains and doling them out to the plants as they needed it. The plants in my neighbour's field, with their shallow, crowded root systems, were starting to suffer. He had to start his irrigation pumps, a huge expense in both fuel and water. I didn't have to do a thing. The mules and the soil were doing the work for me. By the middle of August, the difference was undeniable. The corn in the North 40 was taller, greener, and healthier than any other corn on my farm or in the whole county. The stalks were thick and strong, and on every stalk there weren't 1 but 2 and sometimes 3 large, well-filled ears of corn. The space I had given them wasn't wasted.
The plants had used it to gather more sunlight, to put down deeper roots, and to produce more grain. The harvest began in late September. I hired a custom operator with a combine. He was a young man who had taken over his father's business, and he had a brand new machine, the biggest and most expensive one on the market. It was a marvel of technology, with a cab full of computer screens that could measure everything from grain moisture to yield per acre in real time.
You started on my other fields first. The yields were average, about 175 bushels per acre. Decent, but not great, because of the dry spell in July. Then we moved to the North 40. He pulled the combine onto the field, set his monitors, and started down the first rows. I stood at the edge of the field, my heart in my throat. After he'd gone about 100 yards, the combine slowed down, then stopped. The engine was still running, but he wasn't moving. I thought something was broken. I started to walk out toward him. He opened the door of the cab and leaned out. He had a strange look on his face, a mixture of confusion and disbelief. He beckoned me over. I climbed up the ladder into the cab. It was like stepping into the cockpit of a spaceship. He pointed to one of the screens. It was the yield monitor. The numbers on the screen were fluctuating, but they were all hovering around one central figure, 245. "Is this thing broken?" he asked me. "It's never shown a number that high. Not on this farm. Not on any farm in this county." I looked at the number. 245 bushels per acre. The field that for 50 years had struggled to produce 85, the field that everyone had given up on. I looked out the big window at the sea of golden corn stretching out before us. I thought of my grandfather's question mark in his notebook. "No," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. "It's not broken." We harvested the rest of the field. The number stayed true. Some spots were higher, some a little lower, but the average for the whole 40 acres came in at 245.3 bushels per acre, nearly triple its historical yield. And it was good, heavy corn. The trucks we loaded out of that field were visibly heavier than the ones from my other fields. The elevator operator called me. "What on earth did you do to that North 40? He asked.
"The test weight on this corn is 60 pounds per bushel. I haven't seen 60-pound corn in 20 years. I just told him it was a good year. But it wasn't the year. It was the soil. It was the mules. It was the lesson I had almost been in too much of a hurry to learn. The last truck of corn from the North 40 pulled out of the driveway on a cool Friday afternoon in early October. The dust settled. The sound of the big diesel engine faded into the distance. The quiet that returned was a different kind of quiet from the one that had filled the house at the beginning of the year. This was a full quiet, a satisfied quiet. I was standing by the fence looking out over the harvested field, the golden stubble glowing in the late afternoon sun. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't the triumphant, chest-thumping feeling of proving someone wrong. It was a deeper, calmer feeling.
It was the feeling of having participated in something good, of having healed something that was broken. I was so lost in my thoughts that I didn't hear the truck pull up. It was him, my neighbour, his clean blue Ford idling at the edge of the road, the window rolled down. He didn't get out. He just sat there for a minute, looking at the same thing I was looking at. The stubble field, the tracks of the combine, the sheer undeniable fact of the harvest. He had finished his own harvest a week earlier. I knew from the talk at the co-op that his yields had been down. The dry spell had hurt him. His high population corn, so dependent on water and fertilizer, had suffered. He had spent a fortune on irrigation and it still hadn't been enough. He finally turned his head and looked at me. His face was hard to read. It wasn't angry. It wasn't happy. It was just thoughtful. "Heard the elevator was surprised by your weights," he said. His voice was flat, an observation, not a compliment.
It was a good year for that field, I said, keeping my own voice neutral. There was no need to gloat. The numbers on the scale tickets were all the argument I needed. He nodded slowly, his eyes going back to the field. He was a man who dealt in data, and the data was right in front of him. 40 acres that had outproduced his best ground, with less seed, less fertilizer, and no irrigation. It didn't fit into his spreadsheets. That North 40, he said almost to himself. It always ran wet in the spring. I just nodded. And it was always the first to burn up in July, I added, finishing his thought. We stood there in silence for another minute. A flock of geese flew overhead, their calls echoing in the crisp autumn air. The mules in the pasture behind me had come to the fence. They stood there watching us, their long ears forward, taking everything in. My neighbour looked at the mules. He looked at them for a long time. He wasn't smiling his polite, disbelieving smile anymore. He was just looking at them, as if seeing them for the first time, not as museum pieces, but as tools, as a solution to a problem he hadn't even known existed. Huh, he said. It was just a single short sound, but in that one sound, I heard the whole story. I heard the grudging respect, the dawning understanding, the reluctant concession. It was more satisfying than 1,000 apologies. He put the truck in gear. Well, he said, I've got chores. And he drove away. He didn't wave, he didn't say congratulations, but he didn't need to. The conversation was over. The verdict was in. The patient ground had had its say. I stayed by the fence until the sun went down, the sky turning from orange to purple. The mules came over and rested their heads on the top rail, letting me scratch their ears. Their breath plumed in the cooling air. That winter, I took the money from the harvest and I didn't buy a new loader. I bought the 40 acres to the west of me, a piece of ground that had been abused and neglected for years. The neighbours all said it was worthless. They said it was tired, played out land. And I just smiled, because I knew the secret now. I had my grandfather's notebook, and I had 24 of the best soil consultants a man could ask for. The work was just beginning. That winter was a good one. The snow came early and stayed late, a thick insulating blanket that covered the fields. It was a time for rest, for mending harness, and for planning. I spent a lot of evenings in the barn, the way I had at the beginning of the journey, sitting on an overturned bucket under the single bulb, the notebooks open on my lap. But I wasn't searching for answers anymore. I was just reading, listening to my grandfather's voice across the decades. I read about his struggles, his small triumphs, the daily rhythm of his life, and I understood him in a way I never had when he was alive. I understood his skepticism of things that promised to make life easier, but ended up making it more complicated. I understood his trust in the things he could see and feel and touch, the soil, the animals, the weather. He wasn't against progress. He was just for wisdom. He knew that the newest thing isn't always the best thing, and that some problems can't be solved by throwing more horsepower at them. Some problems require a gentler touch. They require patience. They require paying attention. That's the lesson of the mules. They're not fast. They're not fancy. They are, by their very nature, a deliberate animal. You can't rush a mule. You can't bully it. You have to enter into a partnership with it. You have to convince it that what you want to do is a good idea, and in doing so, you are forced to slow down. You are forced to see the world at their pace, and at that pace, you start to notice things. You notice the way the soil feels under your feet. You notice the subtle shift in the wind. You notice the way a plant leans toward the sun. You stop thinking about the destination, and you start paying attention to the journey. My grandfather's aphorism, the one I'd remembered from my childhood, came back to me again and again.
A man with a machine is always in a hurry. An animal is already there. I finally understood what he meant. The man with the machine is trying to impose his will on the world. The animal is simply living in it. It is already connected to the rhythms of the soil and the seasons in a way that the man in his air-conditioned cab can never be. The mules didn't just break the hardpan in my field. They broke the hardpan in my head. They broke me of the habit of thinking that faster is always better, that bigger is always stronger, that the modern way is always the right way. They taught me that the land isn't a factory floor to be managed for maximum output. It's a living thing, a partner, and like any good partner, it responds not to demands but to respect. It responds to being listened to. The triple yield was a wonderful thing. It paid the bills and secured the farm for another generation. But it wasn't the real victory. The real victory was the quiet moment with Arthur, the seed man, when he held up that handful of dark, living soil and said the word unlocked. The real victory was the single, grudging huh from my neighbour in his clean blue truck. The real victory was the feeling of standing in that field and knowing that I had not just taken from it, but I had given something back. I had helped to heal it. We live in a world that is always in a hurry, a world that values the quick answer over the thoughtful question. We are taught to look for the silver bullet, the technological fix, the easy solution. But the truth is, most of the important problems aren't like that. The really hard problems, the ones that are worth solving, they take time. They take patience. They take a willingness to listen to the quiet voices that the noise of our modern world so often drowns out. Whether it's a piece of stubborn ground, a difficult relationship, or a challenge in your own life, the principle is the same. Sometimes, the best thing you can do is to stop trying to force a solution and just be present. Pay attention. Listen. Trust the slow, patient, deliberate work of healing and growth. Trust the wisdom that is written not in spreadsheets, but in the earth itself. If you've got your own piece of stubborn ground, your own forgotten way of doing things that everybody tells you is foolish, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. Let me know what you've unlocked. And if this story meant something to you, I'd be honoured if you'd subscribe. There's more work to be done.